today we are going to talk about 3 ways to increase the productivity and quality of stems in a relatively small space. If you're like me, you're growing in a backyard and you don't have unlimited space. I personally am growing on a 40 by 90 foot space, which is relatively large in my view for a backyard, but it's not unlimited space. And I know many of you have smaller spaces. So one of the things that I've been trying to do since I started flower farming, which was 3 years ago, was how do I maximize the amount of productivity out of a given area, but not have to do it through intensive farming. And when I say intensive farming, this is the traditional way of flipping a bed as quickly as possible, so that when one crop is done, you're taking it out and you're putting in new seedlings in, hoping to really just maximize the amount of stems you can get out of that one space in a growing season. That's a lot of labor, it's a lot of work, and through vegetable farming online, I've seen other ways to be able to avoid this amount of labor. So for me, I am entering into my 4th year of flower farming. I am in New Jersey in zone 7A. And while a 40 by 90 foot space isn't that big, it's big enough to allow me to do this type of experimentation. And so today I'm ready to share with you the 3 things that I've done and learned from, but I've also had a lot of failures. So I think it's really important for me to talk about my failures during this video so that you can hopefully avoid what I did wrong. All right, without further ado, let's start with number 1. Number 1 is going vertical. And I know that this is going to sound a little bit strange, but going vertical means basically using something like a raised bed in order to perennialize something and get 2 crops out of that area in a very, very small amount of time. So let me give you an example. I grow a lot of lilies, and with the amount of lilies that I grew over the past 2 seasons, it was impossible to perennialize all of them because I would take up so much space. So when I was putting in my summer lily bulbs in 2023, they were going to flower in the fall. I said to myself, why don't I try actually planting them on the bottom of a raised bed? And then afterwards, when they are done, I'm going to let them photosynthesize, cut them back, and then I'm going to put a thin layer of soil and put tulips on top of that. And then what that would mean is I would be able to harvest my tulips in the spring of 2024, take those tulips out since we do treat tulips as annuals, and then allow the lilies to grow afterwards. And so that is exactly what I did. That is actually a method called lasagna planting. And this is a pretty popular method in the landscaping world where people will interplant bulbs. So they'll plant the biggest bulbs on the bottom and then layer with the medium size and smaller size to be able to have staggered bloom times for a container or a landscape space. So you can have continuous blooms from early spring all the way to late spring, sometimes even early summer, depending on what you're putting in there. I did that, and it was actually a pretty big success. It was a smashing success. So I will say that some of my lilies did not have enough time to regenerate because I had planted them in the fall, or they had flower in the fall and they just didn't have enough time to fully photosynthesize. But for the most part, I was able to get lilies for a second season. So what does that look like in terms of numbers? So this is a raised bed that I have, which is about 2 feet by 8 feet by 17 inches. So if you think about it, this is taking a footprint of 16 square feet. It's not a very large footprint. On the very bottom layer, I can fit about 100 to 125 lilies in this space. Lilies, if you want to perennialize them, like daffodils, you should give them a little bit more space than something like a tulip, which are planting egg carton style. So tulips, they can practically almost touch each other. They can be crammed in really, really tightly. But if you want to perennialize something, you do need to give it some space. So lilies, you could fit about 125 in this space. Tulips, I could fit anywhere from 800 to 900 depending on the size of a tulip bulb. And I'm typically talking about size 11, 12 centimeter in diameter bulbs. So these are common sizes for us as flower farmers. So within this one space, we are talking about close to 1,000 stems. My tulips started blooming in late March all the way to mid-April, and I was able to get, call it 800 stems off of this one space. Pull them all out, bulb and all, and in case of you haven't seen what I've done, I did no dig on steroids, which meant that I actually covered the majority of the layer with mulch leaves instead of soil, and that allowed for really easy harvesting and pulling out the full stem with the bulb. So once that was done, the lilies were already peeking through and they were able to really just take off because now they had full sunlight. What that meant was that I had my lilies earlier, and I had them, I would say I had them about a week to 2 weeks earlier than if they were in the ground. I know this because I actually had some lilies in the ground. And the reason why I got them a little bit earlier was because the canopy of the tulips actually acted as protection for the lilies when it got really, really cold. But there was still enough warmth in that bed to stimulate the lily bulbs to start growing. So I ended up getting lilies sometime in like late May, early June. And those lilies, most of them performed really, really well for me. And what I was able to do is I was able to cut them again, let them photosynthesize and basically regenerate again next year. And about a month and a half after the lilies bloomed, which was sometime in like late July, I was able to then put in a new crop in that bed. So all of that means that I got close to 1,000 stems within about, we'll call it 2 months of each other. That is a lot of stems in that small space. So I had 3 of these raised beds. I did the same thing for all 3 raised beds and was basically able to get enough stems for all of my mid-spring for my tulips that I sold retail, and the lilies that I got from there carried me through for like over a month for both my retail and wholesale sales. I also want to throw a nod for going vertical, especially through hydroponic forcing of winter tulips. I did not grow winter tulips this year at scale because of my daughter's treatment. But I want to reemphasize that you can grow a lot of tulips in a really, really small space. This is our mouse fortress. The dimensions are over here, but I can fit about 900 stems in this one small space. So the ability to be able to use vertical space in certain instances can actually give you a really, really big output. I know of some farmers who have a really, really small basement, and their winter production, they are able to do tens of thousands of tulips because winter tulips also have a really fast turnaround time. In fact, I had rooted some tulips to give to some of the nurses and the doctors who are involved in my daughter's treatment. And literally days to maturity was around 30 days, which is amazing. So if you can have really eager pre-cooled bulbs, have an earlier variety, nail down your system, you can probably turn over at least 4 to 5 successions in a really small area in your basement if you're interested in doing winter tulips. That brings me to number 2, which is employing a concept called relay cropping. Now, relay cropping is something that I heard through the vegetable market world. And so if you've never seen this channel, I definitely give Jesse a listen here. His name is also Jesse. But I learned about relay cropping through him. And so the premise is that instead of flipping a bed once a crop is fully mature and done, you are actually planting a second crop before that first crop is fully mature. So typically that looks like planting seedlings in between a row of a maturing crop that probably still has another like month left, or you could even be direct seeding something into the ground. And the point is that by the time the first crop matures, that second crop will be well on its way to maturing. So you've basically taken off a good amount of days to maturity, and that second crop will mature a lot more quickly than if you were to wait for that first crop to be completely pulled out to put it in. Now, what that means is that there's going to be some overlap in time in the ground between these 2 crops. And that actually poses some challenges because this is the part where I had a lot more failures than successes when I tried to employ this. What you want to make sure is you get the timing right, and you also want to make sure that both crops have sufficient sunlight and nutrients in the soil to be able to grow healthily. Because what's the point of having one good crop and one languishing second crop? Then you might as well just wait to flip the bed to turn over. So let me give you some examples of where I went wrong. The first time I tried to do this, I tried to do it with stock and sea holly, and I actually did a video on this. I had never had success with spring stock, still haven't had success, only with fall stock, ironically, through another experimentation. this video here if you want to learn about that. But anyway, I had wanted to give the spring stock a little bit more time in the soil before it got too hot. So I had basically done some relay cropping or interplanting with sea holly. And what I didn't anticipate was that the sea holly was going to grow so fast and the leaves were going to get so big that they were going to completely shade out the stock. So in this case, it was completely mistimed. Another example is I try to do something very similar with anemones and lilies. So anemones, similar to stock, want cooler weather. And with our springs getting really, really hot quickly, I wanted to see if I could plant some lilies next to the anemones to help give them a little bit more shade. The lilies quickly outgrew the anemones to the point where the canopy of the leaves completely shaded out any sun for the anemones. So the anemones actually started budding, but then aborting pretty quickly. So again, another fail on that end. The third fail actually involves summer crops. So I had bought asters from plugs and I put them into the ground. And I had thought, well, this is a bit of a waste of space. I don't want these asters to just be the only things in the ground. So let me direct seed some cosmos. The cosmos, believe it or not, actually took off and completely outgrew and also outshaded the asters. And where I went wrong here was I didn't water in the asters well enough because we had a pretty dry period, but I had watered the seeds of the cosmos well enough so that they would germinate. The lesson here is that it's not just timing, it's also making sure that the plugs that you put in are going to be really, really healthy. So there's a couple of factors here to make sure that you're getting right. But when you do it right, an example here is in 2023, I had some ranunculus, which I didn't get the best productivity out of, but I did get some usable stems, especially for Mother's Day. And then I relay cropped some plugs of straw flower. So I was able to get stems of ranunculus in May. And in early July, I had gotten my first stems of straw flower in the same space. And you can see that this straw flower actually grew really, really big. And it basically became its own row of a singular type of flower. So this would not have been possible to get straw flower so early had I waited for the ranunculus to be completely done before flipping that bed. So there's a lot of different ways that you can relay crop. Sometimes it's just similar to like intercropping, planting two things that are at different stages at the same time. But true relay cropping would be in a market style format. You've got like two rows of, we'll call it maybe like sunflowers or something like that. They are 30 days away from maturity, so halfway in their life cycle, and then you're gonna put something else in the middle, maybe direct seeding cosmos and allowing those cosmos to establish. And by the time the sunflowers are done, then those cosmos are gonna grow up. So in this case, I've given you two examples of crops that are really, really tall. Perhaps you want to choose something that's a little bit more shade loving, maybe something like a snapdragon that you want to flower in the fall. So you can time things so that maybe something that doesn't really love the heat might be able to do a little bit better in the months of July and August because they have the shade and canopy of something bigger. I did this with curcuma and stock. So the reason why I got successful fall stock was because I chose the right variety. But in some of the areas where I got the stock a little bit earlier with taller stems, I had planted them under curcuma, which has really, really broad, big leaves. And the curcuma had basically been done by the end of summer. The curcuma is a really heat-loving type of crop. So the leaves started yellowing in September. And by that point, the stock was already starting to take off. So there's a lot of different ways to try to employ relay cropping. But really the takeaway here is try to put in the second crop a little bit more quickly than what you normally would have done. The third tip here is actually not about increasing the number of stems that you're going to get, but it's increasing the quality or the length of stems, especially for crops that might actually be a little bit shorter or you need a little bit more encouraging because they need shade. So specifically, I'm talking about choosing crops to intercrop with each other or plant next to each other, where one crop will benefit from the shade and therefore stretch a little bit longer. A concrete example here is my interplanting of ageratum with silver shield this past season. So my ageratum grew pretty quickly and I had a lot of ageratum. In fact, I had so many that I didn't know where to put them, which is how this this experiment came to be. So I had some Silver Shield in the ground. And for those of you who don't know, Silver Shield is a really, really great filler. It has a really long vase life because you can actually root the stem. So anything that can create its own roots from the stem has basically an unlimited vase life, assuming you're giving it water and sunlight. But the problem with Silver Shield is that it tends to be short until the fall. So it has a really long time in the ground unless if you're able to plant it in a shadier area. Now, my challenge, believe it or not, is that my field basically has full sunlight. And I've tried planting Silver Shield in my landscaping where there's shade, but the deer will eat it. So what did I do? I planted the plugs of the ageratum next to the Silver Shield. The ageratum started getting pretty big, and the Silver Shield was starting to grow through the nooks and crannies of the ageratum. And the reason why this worked was because the Silver Shield was already mature enough and big enough where it wasn't in its early stages of just establishing. I think if I had put in plugs of Silver Shield underneath more mature ageratum, this wouldn't have worked. It was the opposite way. So even though the ageratum eventually grew bushier than the Silver Shield, it encouraged the Silver Shield to really branch out. And what that meant was I got a lot of usable stems off of one Silver Shield. For the typical Silver Shield plant, I might be able to get like 3 good usable stems if they're under full sunlight sometime in September. In this case, I was able to get earlier stems because they were stretching, and I was able to get more stems because more of the side branching shoots were usable. So in one Silver Shield plant, I had gotten like 7 stems, 7 or 8 stems. And what that meant was within 3 Silver Shield plants, I had gotten more than 2 bunches that I was able to sell wholesale. Had I known this, I would have intercropped all of my Silver Shield with the ageratum. Another example here is when I intercropped celosia and zinnias. Now, zinnias typically don't have an issue with stem length, but you might sometimes have some side shoots of zinnias that look really great from a bloom head perspective, but the stems are too short. So in this case, if you were to intercrop that zinnia with something that's a little bit bushier, it doesn't have to be celosia. In my case, it was celosia. It's going to encourage those side shoots to grow a little bit longer. The key is to make sure whatever you're intercropping with is either bushy, but also has a similar level height as the first crop that you're trying to get longer stems out of. So that way it encourages anything that's near the bottom to really stretch up. So as a result, I got more usable stems of zinnias from the small patch of celosia that I had. And this was actually a lot of self-seeded celosia, which is why it looks so dense. But I was really surprised at just how long some of these stems were from the zinnias. And I would never have gotten a stem that long had I had just planted zinnias on their own in a row. One of the other new crops that I grew this year was callas. Callas come from rhizomes. And although callas are a pretty popular cut flower in the international market, the callas that I grew actually were a lot shorter than I expected them to be. I mean, they were still usable in bouquets, but we're talking about probably like 14 inches versus what I would have expected like 16 or 18 inches. And so I quickly realized that callas would benefit from being in the shade. And so what did I do? I started intercropping them with ageratum, actually in the same raised bed where I got the 1,000 stems from in the spring and early summer. So I was able to put this crop in by mid-late summer. And what happened? My callas became a lot longer under the canopy of the ageratum because they were encouraged to stretch for the sunlight, and I got really nice long stems that sold really well to florists and also looked really, really good in bouquets. So these are just 3 things that I've done through experimentation. I'm sure many of you have also done a lot of experimentation at a necessity because you've had small spaces. So please let me know in the comments below what you've done. Now, this video is part 1 of a 2-part series because what I really wish I had when I started flower farming was understanding how much can I get out of a given space? And what I've learned is that how much you get out of a given space is directly related to what you're putting into that space. So not just how intensively are you farming and trying to flip the space, but what's your crop selection? What are the days to maturity? Are you trying to do things like intercropping or relay cropping to try to get multiple crops coming out of a given space? So in our next video, we're actually going to talk about the output or the productivity that I got from my 40 by 90 foot space. I'm going to give you examples of specific outputs and number of stems I got from each bed. There are beds that I've perennialized, so that bed really can't be flipped. There are beds that I did flip multiple times. There are beds with crops that had really long days to maturity, like Lysianthus, and you really couldn't do that much with it. And so we're going to talk and compare and talk about the trade-offs with certain crops, but also give you a more realistic understanding of what you can expect in terms of productivity. So I hope this video is helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And in the meantime, here's a quick update on E.
Can you call for Chance? Where's Chance? Is it Chance?